It started when after college, I started working in galleries. A little backstory on that, I was really interested in video production. I studied video and film production, and I was really interested in this concept of the film festival, having different kind of mini programs of different themed, films, and having talkbacks and discussions about the films. So I became really interested in exhibitions, and I started working in galleries, but immediately that was unsatisfying, right? Because it's a narrow demographic and population of people that go to Chelsea or went to Soho and would look at this work. So I immediately started curating independently. And I started curating group shows of artists that I thought were really trying to push the envelope with their work. And the exhibitions were interdisciplinary. So not only was there fine art, but there was also live music and film screenings kind of in their own right. And they were these kind of like one-night art festivals that I was doing 10 years ago. And I became more interested in the events themselves than the exhibitions. Some of the events I would do would be public programs, workshops, panel discussions, talkbacks, things like that, which eventually kind of took my interest much more. I started grad school about 5 years ago, and I was trying to figure out how to continue my creative practice, do this kind of curating independently, but I really wanted to create kind of a public program series in tandem with an exhibition, but not in service to it, because usually their public programs are in service to the exhibition, right? Not the other way around. So at the same time, when I was trying to kind of reconcile my creative practice and curating, I was in grad school for visual culture, so I was studying a lot about systems of power and networks and invisible narratives and all these really, really heavy subjects that I was completely fascinated by. And I really was interested in the discussion of the way images made us who we are and our location in the world, and all of those things. So it's really stressful to be in grad school, and it's really stressful to read, Foucault, over and over.
Very stressful. I think he is designed to generate stress, actually.
But fascinating. I mean, I think I read Discipline and Punish, the same passages over and over and over, and so you kind of live and breathe and sleep and eat that stuff. So. Spending a lot of time with my grad school friends, because who else wants to listen to you talk about networks of power for 3 hours, right?
That's right.
So whenever I would see them, I would always bake something and bring them something carby and sweet, because I swear it made us investigate each other more, investigate these theories more, and it opened them up. It just kind of, they would just kind of be a little bit more vulnerable when they would, eat the banana bread I made,
Do you think it's the food or the action of eating, or eating amongst social?
It's both. I definitely think it's the sugar, because sugar is a stimulant. And sugar is also comforting, to most people.
Yes.
Some people have issues with sugar and it makes them anxious, and, they don't want to eat it because they think they're gonna, put on some weight or gain a complex or something. But mostly sugar is comforting, and the process of eating is vulnerable because your mouth is open. You have to, it's a stranger kind of process and physical animation that you have that is similar to talking, but it's very different. So yes, I think it's both. And then I just was baking all the time. As I was in my kitchen baking all of these things, I started identifying those theories with the food that I was making.
Oh, how so?
I was thinking a lot about public and private because of these networks of power, and I was thinking about the things that I made in my kitchen privately, then I would share publicly, and it was kind of this, you know, I don't know, kind of like revealing of myself, and also I was, you know, asking people to eat this thing and they were eating it, and I was in control of them in that way, in this eater and feeder relationship, and, you know, I was just really kind of becoming really interested and obsessed with that. And at the same time, you know, really thinking, like I said, about this creative curatorial practice, and very frustrated with the idea of the white cube. What's that book by Brian O'Doherty? I read it also 100 times, Beyond the White Cube.
Yep.
So I kind of had this idea while I was in grad school, and I thought, I want to have a bake sale, and I want to, because that was the way for me to bake things and give them to people and have conversations with them over sugar. I also wanted to do that in galleries because I wanted to make a mess. I wanted to have chocolate on the walls. Like, I wanted people to come up and, you know, have jelly on their hands and touch the walls, and I wanted to kind of mess up the space a little bit. So that's kind of how I started this process. So throughout all of that, I remained an organizer of objects, of people, of environments, and throughout all of that process, created situations that were conducive to people talking to me. So that's kind of how I kind of entered into the place of being in the public and making something rather than just putting art up on the wall.
You brought up a really, I feel like, compelling quandary when you first started to answer the question about how you got to the place of being an artist, and you know, played with many terms. You tried on many kind of roles and positions for yourself. I want to hear you speak a little bit more about what is the hesitation, if that's the right word, to claim yourself as an artist, and why, you know, there was the need to try on so many different labels. Have you found one?
I go back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah. The hesitation is because I work with people, and you know, calling myself an artist is kind of taking ownership and authorship over certain things, and, you know, that's embedded in what I do is a certain level of experimentation and vulnerability, which I think artists, you know, can inhabit, but I don't want to be the person that says this is how it is. I want it to be a conversation and a dialogue, and I think that right now the word artist creates this idea of something confusing or just, you know, unattainable to a lot of people, and I don't really want to be that. So
do you feel like it's more about what it is that you do rather than what you call yourself?
What do you mean more about?
In relation to your creative practice, you know, is it more about the doing for you than it is about the labeling?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. And, you know, the work, you know, the work that I do, inherent in this idea of like social practice and socially engaged work, is very much like art or a creative idea and something else. So a creative idea and canoeing, a creative idea, not that I've done canoeing projects, but a creative idea and pipe smoking, creative idea and food or cooking. Label-wise, I think I'm very much an organizer, or facilitator, or producer, you know, of something. But the artist label is really easy, and, you know, it's something that if people don't understand something that I'm doing, if I say I'm an artist, they're like, oh, it makes sense that I don't understand it. That's kind of a bold thing to say, I guess, but you know, I think that if you're saying I'm organizing this, and then they expect you to have the answer, you know.
Right, right. Well, there are a few things, you know, I could go in the direction of talking about the public and the private, those two concepts that you brought up early, and also this notion of authorship that you brought up as well, because there is a bit of a power dynamic that you set up and that you have also acknowledged as, you know, kind of in cooking and making things and then bringing these things to people for them to consume. So I'm wondering where you see yourself in that power relationship. You know, it's, you know, there's that reluctance to claim authorship, but then there is that, you know, there is that claim to authorship as well.
You know, it's interesting. I think I would rather choose the word leader that I feel comfortable with and am excited by, because feeding people and you know, making food for them is you know, that is a vulnerable thing. I think that giving something to giving anything to someone is kind of a vulnerable place, because they can reject you, they cannot like it, you know. So, you know, I think that I am interested in being a leader and getting people excited, because I want to eat with people. So, and I know people want to eat with other people, but the act of speaking up and saying, like, I'm going to be vulnerable here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I want this from you, or I want this from this group of people. That's really hard to do. A lot of people feel socially anxious about that. Right. So I'm okay to say, like, well, let's do this then. Like, I'm going to be a leader here, and I'm going to organize us, and I'm going to create a few different values or pick a few different things that we will focus on, and then you go. Then you tell me, how we're gonna do it, and what is going to be the end result, I guess, if there is one. Yeah. So, it's less about this is my idea and I am the author of it, but it's more like, I know we all have this idea, so I'm just gonna kind of be the cheerleader here and start it.
And what kind of ideas are you setting up through food?
Yeah, well, this idea of being vulnerable is really important to me. This idea of social anxiety is really important to me. I think on the one hand, I'm setting up this, those two ideas of, let's just shut down the left side of our brains and let the right side kind of take over, and let's kind of, sounds kind of kumbaya-ish, but let's kind of just be one a little, and let's really just talk like it's 100 years ago and we're sitting on the porch drinking some tea, and let's talk about our families. I want to get to know you, because regardless of any social boundaries that are in place, and I know that a lot of people identify with that, and rightfully so, and I understand that we can't completely dissolve, any sort of hierarchy, social hierarchy that exists, but we both have things about us that we like and don't like, and let's kind of talk about that and have some fun, or have a moment and be a little vulnerable. So, and then it's also, the thing that I'm also interested in is this social anxiety, about how difficult it is to want to speak up and to want to have a generous moment with someone and not know how to, or feel really nervous about being rejected, or all that fear involved there. So I'm really interested in setting up the idea of saying to someone, like, it's all right, and you can come to me when you want to come to me. I'm going to set up this environment, situation for you, and you can participate on any level you want to participate on. But then food is really, for me, a really incredible medium to do that with, you know, for all the obvious reasons. Food's a social lubricant. We have a lot of familial and cultural ties to food. We identify with it. It's very much like us. It's living and breathing. The textures, the smells, the tastes, they're all like human, you know, they're all a lot like us. I think that in that way, because food has so many multi-sensory qualities to it, it's an amazing interpretive medium to discuss, you know, in this multi-sensory way, something that may not be so easy to discuss via talking,
right,
or via looking. Mm-hmm. You know, if I go to a museum and I see a work of art and I'm like, what am I looking at? You know, I can read the little label, or I can go on a lecture tour or something like that. But if I taste something, you know, maybe that'll resonate with me in a different way. I learned a lot recently about multi-sensory learning, I think, or just how kids, you know, the variations of the way that they learn. And some kids are visual learners, and some kids are oral, AURL learners, mm-hmm. and some have ADHD and they need to get up and move around and they need to feel things, and that's how they learn. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm very much, I'm very much a kinetic learner. So, so that is how I want to learn. I want somebody to say, smell this, and look at that, mm-hmm. and then tell me what you think. You know, mm-hmm. What do you think? What do you think? Let's talk about that. It's yeah. I mean, I think that's part of a big part of why I do what I do. Also, I use food to interpret art a lot, because you know, it's sometimes a difficult thing to understand. You know, a lot of people don't give themselves permission to say, this is what this painting is about, because the artist has so much authorship mm-hmm. over their work mm-hmm. that the person says, well, that can't be what it's about if my thoughts are not right or valid, you know? Mm-hmm. So, and food is also an incredibly accessible medium. Here, at least, you know, in the US and in Western countries, like, food is something that everybody understands, mm-hmm. right? We all have access to some kind of food, and we all eat every day, and it's just something that is a little bit more understandable than a lot of other information sources out there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to hear you talk a little bit about your projects, because your practice allows for many different kind of models mm-hmm. of ways of getting people to congregate around food or for food. Could you talk about your approach mm-hmm. to this?
Sure.
Strategies?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I did this bake sale table mm-hmm. for 2 years. It was called Sweet Tooth of the Tiger, and that was kind of, I was just blindly wanting to talk to people and make baked goods. I felt compelled to do this. So, and that was my first kind of project of this kind. So that was a performative kind of like roving, you know, entity, I guess. And then, you know, I started thinking more about what I could do. And so my projects have evolved, like you're saying, over the past several years, because they're all experiments. Right. So some of the other projects that I've done have been more long-standing projects called Community Cooking Club. So that project really hones in on the idea of a dissolved hierarchy and a lateral learning structure, and kind of a democratic eating environment and cooking environment. So it's kind of an experimental cooking class where there's no teacher and there's no expert and there's no author.
Oh, how do you set that up?
Yeah, so that is set up by artists and authors and creative people will give me a bunch of recipes that are organized around a theme. Mm-hmm. We go out and buy the ingredients. It's a predominantly vegetarian menu because it keeps costs low, and it's also healthier. I'm not a vegetarian at all, but eating less meat is good.
Yeah.
And buy it at the green market, and for a really low budget, and it's always a ton of food, and it's awesome. And then I've gotten donated kitchen space from different places, most recently NYU. They have an amazing teaching kitchen there. And set the ingredients and the recipes and the kitchen tools up in stations around the kitchen, and we introduce what we're going to be cooking, and then people just kind of pick a station with people they know or they don't know, and they start cooking. So it kind of is this environment of skill sharing, but somebody who might know how to slice a leek, you know, and some person might look at a leek and say, like, I've never seen this before in my life. Well, they get a little bit of an education from the person next to them, but maybe that person next to them is having like relationship troubles, right? And so they're like, oh, I'm dating this girl, and like, you know, and that person who doesn't have knife skills can offer maybe some emotional support or some advice, or, you know, a story of their own, some empathy. So it's kind of like the cooking kind of stands in for relationship building. And then we all eat together at the end, and it's always delicious and amazing, and it's great. And then I've done other kind of smaller projects. Some projects have been at museums. Most recently I did a lollipop making workshop based on a Keith Haring drawing up at the Brooklyn Museum for their teen night program. So there were thousands of teens there, like, helping me make these lollipops. And
fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Complete, you know, energetic, like so much energy, and it's really exciting. And then, you know, the kids eat the lollipops and they're like, okay, this is supposed to taste like a Keith Haring. What does that mean? You know, but then I get to talk to them about it, and the painting wasn't right there. So, you know, they had to be encouraged to kind of like go back up and look at the painting. But I think there was a printout of it. In any case, you know, that's another way of something that is a little bit more of like a workshop method, similar to Community Cooking Club, where people kind of learn the steps of something, and they, you know, get to kind of taste it and take it home. And then another kind of performative thing I did at the Whitney with Trade School, for their kind of like one night at the Whitney, it was great, was looking at works of art in the art history canon, like Warhol and Kahlo, and who else was there? A couple other people, and the work was projected, and then everyone got to eat what they saw. They were works of art with food in them, so everyone got to eat what they saw in the artwork. And so that was a literal iteration of multi-sensory learning. So instead of it being kind of an interpretation, it was like a literal, you know, eating. And I created this menu we were talking before, these design menus that I make, and that was kind of the first one that I had made. And it was a little interactive menu, and it was kind of like a worksheet, and they could fill it out about what they were tasting, and they had to talk to each other at the table. And that was exploring ideas of, you know, multisensory learning, and you go to a museum, and who is this person telling you these facts, and why are we only learning about facts, and how adult art education is really not interpretive at all, and it's not so exciting. And so I was using food as a way for people to kind of latch on to these bigger ideas in the artworks themselves. You know, my mind is going blank now thinking about other things I've done. You wanna?
You also do discussion, kind of almost like round tables. You've used beer.
Oh, with Eric, right?
As a way to kind of, you know, stimulate conversation and get people talking
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's another methodology.
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, last year at the Open Engagement Conference, I, along with my friend Chelsea Haynes and Eric Steen, we did something called the Pub Discussion Series. So it was, we worked with a brewery, mm-hmm. and they brewed Eric's Heather beer, which was the flavor that he came up with that was most relevant to the conference. Mm-hmm. And at the conference, the environment is really kind of like heady discussion that folds in on itself over and over and over, because everyone's trying to define socially engaged practice, mm-hmm. and everyone's saying it's not this, but it's this, and it's not this. So we realized, also with the Creative Time Summit, we realized that after the conversation, the best conversations happen on the subway and in the bar with your friends and with like a few people, and not with the greater, with the greater participants there, mm-hmm. that were at the conferences. So we just kind of, had the beer available at the bar, and we made little slips of paper, again, this kind of like worksheet thing. People were able to write what they wanted to talk about and pin it to their lapel, and I'm not sure if they ended up really talking about that, but that's okay, right? Because it's an experiment, and at least there was this environment organized for them to really digest, food word again, right. to digest this information and to really kind of engage in like a familial way over, mm-hmm. over food and over drink. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you probably have what it sounds like, more experience with the definition of the phrase social engagement than I have. So, for me, I've kind of boiled it down to, the idea of interactions between individuals, and that individuals are a necessary part of whatever the creative practice is. And they're also necessary in the evaluation of the success of that project, in whichever means one decides to evaluate, So I'm curious to hear how you would define social engagement.
Yeah, it changes all the time. Mm-hmm. I think I define social engagement or social practice as, and similarly to you, an environment conducive to people engaging and investigating an issue or an idea. Mm-hmm. Now that is so broad, and that could include looking at paintings on a wall too. I mean, that can include a lot of different things. But I think the difference between I think what narrows that down a little bit is when the creative idea is instigated by one person or a group of people. Mm-hmm. And there's this hyper focus on this one idea, like I said before, canoeing or pipe smoking or cooking. And that one person or that group of people, call them artists, call them whatever, creatives, leaders, whatever you want to call them, they unpack and unravel and mess things up, and they then say, can you help me put this back together, mm-hmm. in a way that you want to see? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is what's really special about social practice, because you cannot do it alone. And social interaction, in that kind of sense, for me, is defined as being vulnerable, mm-hmm. asking for help. I mean, help meaning like creating an invitation, and experiencing what it's like, experiencing the tension between vulnerability and that social anxiety, mm-hmm. that fear. So I think that just participating and interacting, for me, is not enough. Mm-hmm. I think that I really want people to be like their full body involved in this process of their own understanding. And it's not, I want to know what you think so then I could learn more, but I want to know what you think because I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about that, and I want to kind of like suss out, you know, everybody's kind of social position here and their idea about this thing. And, you know, even if you're angry, even if you're mad and you're cranky about it, like let's work that out, you know? Yeah. I think that's probably a good platform.
It sounds great, you know. It's a great place to start to cull from, you know. So the relationships that you have with people, either while eating food or in making food, do you study the way people eat? Do you study the culture of food consumption as just ways to observe how to sort of compose that type of system or types of systems?
You mean like as research or outside of this?
As research, maybe.
Or inside of the project?
Well, I think I'm thinking about research that you might not even realize that you're doing. You know, I'm thinking about yourself as an observer. You know, just kind of being so focused on eating and creating the experience of around food. If you take note of the different ways in which people indulge in that activity.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, all the time. Yeah, I'm constantly smelling everything. I'm constantly, somebody just asked me the other day, I was eating a new flavor of granola bar that I hadn't tried before, and he said, "Is that good?" And I said, "Yeah, it is actually. There's more coconut in this than I thought, and the apricot's a little too sweet," but you know, I'm talking to him about it, and he didn't want to know anything about the coconut and the granola bar or the apricot, but he was like, "You look like you're really enjoying that." And I was like, "You know, I am." And he was like, "It's written all over your face." And it's like, I not only observe everybody else eating and you know, everything you're talking about, but I'm also so self-aware and so self-conscious about my own taste and my own body and how it reacts to everything that I'm consuming and eating. And so that is probably like top 3 reason why I do this work, because I just want to talk about it. You know, I just want to talk to someone about the coconut, and I want to talk to people about, like, how do you break open a coconut? Do you know? I just am so curious all the time about all of those things. I grew up, you know, I'm half Italian. I grew up talking about food all of the time. It's just a language, you know, and it's just, it's a way, like I was saying before, for me to be vulnerable and a way to open people up. And I think you learn things about people while they're eating and while you're talking about food that maybe you wouldn't have known before.
What has food taught you about people?
What has food taught me about people? I think just what I was kind of touching on before, that people really want to be vulnerable and they really, really want to connect. And they're looking for a way to do that, especially in the city, right, where it's kind of not cool to like be so open and be so exposed. You know, it's really hard. You're not expected to do that. Things are very fast. You know, you don't sit down it's not Europe. You know, you don't sit down for a leisurely meal. Everything is very fast, and nobody really tastes what's going on in their mouth. I mean, I read something recently where we taste like 20% of our food because we don't really stop to chew and you know,
Such
we
a
just,
shame.
yeah, it's like we're like dogs. Just
almost like
chew
wasteful.
and then swallow is
Yeah.
really, it really is. It's like an incredible luxury that we have. But I've been learning a lot about these conscious, on a lot of meditation retreats, they have conscious eating. And at Google, they have this too in their offices, where it's silent. It's a silent cafeteria or silent eating space, and you are required, or you're asked, to chew really slowly and to really think about what you're tasting. And when I've done that with people before, a lot of people have said, I never realized soy sauce was so salty. And I'm like, that's great. Like, that's a new thing, you know, for you. And that's a new point of information for you, you know, and it informs, maybe they don't, on a conscious level, doesn't really inform very much, but, you know, maybe it does. But also the fact that they're saying to me, I never thought that soy sauce was so, it's just a window.
It's a revelation, you know, to bring a new sense of awareness to everyday action, you know, or even something that you're used to eating frequently enough, you know, being able to find something new about it.
And it goes both ways. So it's a revelation, bringing something new to something you do every day, but also using the food in an unfamiliar environment, bring something familiar to something you're not comfortable with, you know. So it's just great. Food's awesome. It's just a great facilitator of emotion.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I agree, but I'm totally biased because I love to eat. So I know that there's a reluctance to call yourself an artist, and maybe even to call what it is that you do art. But if you will allow me just to kind of throw the art word out there, I'm, you know, trying to, in this process, locate where the art is. Where does the art happen in social engagement?
It's a really good question. That's, I think a lot of people are asking that same question too, and that is that question of aesthetics versus ethics. Are you helping? I mean, lately, no, you are not helping a community. You are, you know, working within a community or working within a group of people, right?
And you're saying in terms of what the language is around the ethical question of social engagement.
Right, because that is just, you're taking privileged position in that way. So that is not.
And how do you feel? I mean, do you agree with that kind of, you know, ethical dilemma in a way? I mean, because I make a distinction between morals and ethics. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like the notion of doing something good, or whether something is good or bad, is more of a moral. These are moral qualifications, and ethics functions on a different level. You know, ethics is, for me, more about the systems and structures that kind of influence particular behaviors that underlie, you know, a behavior, and then that behavior is kind of judged as whether that's a good reaction or a bad reaction. You know?
Right.
So, you know, how do you position yourself? We'll start first with the ethical question and the moral question, and then we'll talk about aesthetics.
Yeah. I don't really feel in line with going into a community that is not my own and asking a question of a group of people, because that's what you're doing with this work. Often you're asking questions, I think. So I work a lot within my own communities. You know, I'm a queer woman, so I am really interested in working within that community because I have a voice in that community, because I identify with that community. Communities I don't necessarily identify with, and if I were to be honing in on a specific issue in that community, similarly if I'm honing in on an issue in the queer community because I want to, because that affects me, I don't know if I would I agree, I think, a little bit. In terms of all the rhetoric and in terms of all of the upheaval and the, you know, all of that stuff, you know, I mean, I think it's with everything.
Right.
People split hairs and they, it's some people, that's their job to do that. You know, they're writers, or journalists, for instance, you know, and that's where they're coming from. So I am just coming from a place where I am kind of speaking for myself a little bit. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And, you know, if you wanted to put out an intention, you know, say the intention behind your work would be?
Oh, my intention?
Yeah.
That's a big question. The intention behind my work, in terms of the ethics?
Or that compels you. No, I mean, you don't have to think about it in terms of ethics, but I think when you think about intentions, it definitely guides kind of in that way without having to demand, you know, having demanded a ethical or moral claim from your work, you know.
You know,
what's your motivation?
The vulnerability. I mean, I think I'm going to be pushing the vulnerability card until the day I die in everything I do, because I'm so fascinated by it, and want more people to be vulnerable more of the time. Who knows, if that were to really happen, we might just not be able to take control of anything. Like, we probably wouldn't get anything done if that's what happened. But you know, our relationships are the most important aspects of our lives. Like, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's why we're here on Earth. That's why I think I'm here. So everything I do revolves around those relationships. And there's a lot of ways that we protect ourselves and protect those relationships that we have, because being exposed is so difficult. And I'm interested in ways to investigate that and unpack that. And yeah, so probably vulnerability is my intention.
So then could we say that you are involved in uncovering the aesthetics of vulnerability?
Yeah, maybe. The aesthetics of vulnerability, I mean, God, that could look like so many different things. Right. I mean, the aesthetics of vulnerability is somebody making a plate of food and saying, here you go, you know? The aesthetics of vulnerability is somebody sitting, eating that food, looking up at the person that just is feeding them, like, you know, what are you feeding me, you know? Letting go of that control of eating something somebody is feeding you, taking control of consciously eating that food and saying, like, I like this, I appreciate this, you know, this could use more salt, you know, whatever. Feeling like you're on, even though there is a power dynamic between eater and feeder, and it goes both ways. Yes. Positioning yourselves on the same level through the conversation, I think that is the aesthetics of vulnerability. Yeah. And
then, so back to the question of locating the art.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. I was mentioning before how graphic design is sometimes not acceptable art or aesthetics in social practice, but I think that it's a wonderful part of social practice.
Why is that?
Because we use the language of the thing that is other than art in social practice. So we use the language of canoeing because these are things that we're obsessed with, you know? I mean, these are things that we want to learn and be taught and then teach other people and learn some more about. So there's a lot of research that goes into these projects, and you know, the language isn't, you know, I mean, it's typography, it's written often, you know, or I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. I'm thinking about canoeing. But
So was I.
right? I mean, because it's fascinating. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the art is in the fascination. The art is in the details. The art is in the fact that somebody spent this time to know everything there is to know about the, you know, little screw that goes in the tip of the canoe or whatever, you know, or learning everything there is to know about making butter or, you know, making the perfect egg or whatever it is. The art is in those details, and the art is in that effort. And if we can have conceptual art and have that be in the canon, then so can, you know, the art be in the obsessive details of social practice, all of the research, all of the knowledge that that artist gains from going deeper, pulling it out, pulling it apart, talking about it, having workshops, having, you know, expeditions, having investigations. You know, I think the art is really inherent in there. And then how that artist chooses to output that information, you know, is their project. And, you know, the aesthetics comes in the form of that canoe. It comes in the form of the plated vegetables, you know, and I do think it's important for people who are making social practice projects, or, you know, anything that could be defined as social practice project, where they're obsessive about something and they gain all this knowledge and then they output and they want to talk about it and learn from others about it. I think that the aesthetic should always be considered. I think that if you, I don't know why I'm using this canoe reference so much, but it's in there. If you were to just get a boat, you know, and, you know, you thought, okay, I'm considering this boat and I just want it to be whatever it is. So that's a decision, right? Because in art, everything is a decision. You make a painting, you're deciding where to put everything on the canvas, right? So as long as somebody is making sure that they're making decisions, then that is something they can stand behind. And, you know, those are kind of, I think that's kind of the way that's where the art is. That's kind of why it's art. It's not just a creative idea that we want to talk about. And there's been all of this criticism in the past few years about how social practice is not about conversation. And it's not just about people sitting around a table talking. There has to be something else. There has to be attention there. You know, there has to be all these other things. So aesthetics are very important, and they're very important in general. They're very important to me. However, it's mostly about the decision,
right,
and how to output this information.
Well, you touched on a little bit when we were talking just now about aesthetics, or when you were talking, and we also spoke about it earlier before the camera started rolling. But I want to hear you more talk about documentation, about just how you output what it is that you're doing. You know, to in order to inform people about what you're doing, or just to document it for yourself. Well, it's interesting because documentation and evaluation are, I think, two of the most difficult things to talk about with this work. And I know that there have been a couple of people who have, you know, written a lot about this kind of work, and they're still like, I'm not sure. Let's keep talking about it. So documentation is incredibly important. I think a lot in part because you need to sustain these projects, and you need to show people what you're doing and why you're doing it. I think that if the project existed just for the experience, we wouldn't really need documentation other than mementos, or, you know, having a nostalgic moment a year later looking back, right? Or using them as reference material for yourself and thinking like, okay, what decision did I make there, and how did this work, and helping jog your memory. But, you know, documentation is a way to, like I said, sustain through grants, through
presentations, anytime you have to convince somebody of the project that you did and they weren't there, documentation stands in that place. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of times these projects happen and you write about it, it's like, okay, I did this thing and this happened. That does not, that's just words on a page, you know, and the photograph is there, but like we were talking before, is it just people standing around looking at something, eating? That doesn't necessarily look like anything, right? Mm-hmm. So then again, you refer back to the thing you're writing about, but who knows what it was like? Who knows how it happened? And, you know, part of that is nothing will be as good as really being there. Right. But also, you know, are you padding it a little bit? You know, are you making it sound way cooler than it really was? You know, and you know, not to sound too critical, but sometimes that happens. You know, and sometimes, you know, there is that. That desire to be like, well, this was my intention, mm-hmm. and then I kind of did this project and it was all right, you know, and maybe there were some parts that failed, which is also part of this practice because it's all an experimentation. Mm-hmm. And I think something that I try to do all the time is not necessarily test a lot of the foods that I make that are interpretations of whatever the project is, mm-hmm. because I want to make it for the first time in front of people, because that's also a way that I'm like vulnerable and experimenting, and I'm like, listen, you know kind of just as much about this as I do, mm-hmm. or I read about this but I haven't done it yet, mm-hmm. so let's hope for the best, you know. So maybe that didn't go so well, but on my website or on this grant application, I'm like, I did this thing, you know, and it's like, it's there. So video is really helpful, something I'm starting to think a lot more about. Mm-hmm. And you know why? Because of Kickstarter. So that's also kind of a grant thing too.
That's right, for sure.
Yeah, and not necessarily to make a Kickstarter page, but because of the Kickstarter video model, mm-hmm. where you're like, you set an intention, you show some documentation, and then you wrap up saying, and now this is what I'm gonna do, mm-hmm. you know? And so that's something I'm thinking a lot about, and want to start doing a little bit more with my work too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, you know, documentation in the ephemera, you know, when I make a printed, designed, interpretive menu, where I list out all of the foods that I made and kind of why, and it's a little poetic, and, mm-hmm. you know, graphic design is very much a part of that. That is definitely documentation, and it provides a lot of context, and it's not just me explaining what the project is, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's just kind of an inherent limitation to, you know, writing as a form of trying to communicate what had happened, and then the photograph as a static document of mm-hmm. what has happened.
And a lot of the language around this kind of work is slightly academic, mm-hmm, so mm-hmm. that's alienating.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
That's one of my challenges anyway, you know, it's about how do I communicate to people so that they don't have to have read, they don't have to see like citations and have to go back to a source in order to be able to respond.
I sometimes I read things and I think, just say what you're doing, because you just can't use all that language. It doesn't make any sense. Right. You know? Right. Maybe it sounds better to you, but.
Right. Well, you know, it's a really great exercise in being concrete about abstract things. Yeah. And I think that that's kind of the work that we are engaged in. That's a really good point, yeah. You know, mm-hmm. trying to be concrete, attempting to be concrete mm-hmm. about abstract things, which is, I think, a very productive dichotomy in this way. You know, it's like, well,
it goes back, I mean, it's going back, you know, it's breaking down this canon, it's breaking down all of the reasons that we are making this work to begin with, mm-hmm. because we want to be creative and we don't have to want to have a degree to do it, mm-hmm. you know, mm-hmm. even though most of us do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's, you know, that's a whole different
Yes, that's another discussion, yeah.
So you have talked a lot about vulnerability. That's a very important word, term, and idea for you.
Yep.
And I am very interested in notion of generosity as, you know, kind of what is the support for this exchange between people, and the impulse that runs through social engagement. And when you were displaying that gesture, you know, of the giving and receiving, which is obviously an exchange, you know, using food between people, you spoke about it in terms of vulnerability. So I'd like to hear you talk about if you can draw a connection between this notion of vulnerability and generosity, because they seem in gesture to be very similar.
I think you have to be generous to be vulnerable. And I think you have to be vulnerable to be generous. So they're very similar, but I think that they could precede each other. You know, there is the gift economy. Sometimes the gift economy, or this phrase, this kind of academic thing, is put forward as giving away something because you're passionate about it, and you just want this person to take this thing that you're giving them and to be empowered by that. But I think the gift economy is very much about the return of generosity. So I think that even though your intention is to not accept anything back, you are wanting that person to get something out of it. Often people are giving something away for free, and so my understanding, this is all to say, my understanding of the gift economy is, even if you don't expect an object back, if I give you some tea and then I go over your house the next time and you don't even offer me tea, it's like, oh, well, you know, I didn't expect anything. First of all, socially, most people do expect something. I mean, if my mom were invited over to someone's house and she invites someone over to her house and she makes them steak and lobster, right? Because she's like, wants to celebrate their relationship by eating this great food, and then she goes over their house and the way that they celebrate their relationship is by eating ramen. My mom, and I know a lot of moms, would be like, she spent $2.99 on me. I spent $100 on her, you know, like I work hard for that money. I thought our relationship meant the same thing. There's a lot of social implications with giving things. So, and even if I give you some tea, right, and I go over your house and you don't give me any tea, at the time of me giving you the tea, I want you to be happy. I want you to feel comfortable. I want you to feel safe. I'm trying to nurture you. So I'm putting that on you, and I'm saying, please feel nurtured. Here is some tea. Okay? So I think a lot about generosity is this exchange in a way, and that's just to say it's just an exchange in a way that a lot of people don't really think it's an exchange. It takes vulnerability to do that, because we're asking somebody to accept something, not reject us. We're asking somebody to maybe do what we want them to do a little. Like, I want you to feel comfortable in my home, so I'm going to give you some tea, you know?
And I want to be in your presence.
Right.
I want to be present with you.
Exactly, So, right, so it's a lot about desire, and it's... but it's good to be generous, you know. I think it's hard though to be generous and to not expect something back, because you have an intention when you're generous, right? But like I'm saying, I'm going around in circles, but what I'm saying is the social anxiety that comes with generosity is sometimes a really difficult hurdle to get over. There's a lot of negotiation involved, whether it's conscious or not. A lot of it is totally just socially naturalized, and excuse me, and it's just a really vulnerable place to be in. And once you kind of say, okay, like, I'm going to do this with you, like, that's when I think the real exchange can really happen.
Right. Kind of just in that acknowledgement or that acceptance of coming along.
It's a great word, acceptance. Yeah, that's a good word to use. Yeah. I hope I didn't sound too negative on that, but yeah.
No,
okay,
no.
good.
Well, that concludes, that's it.
Okay.
I think you got it.
Great.
You hit all the points.
Sweet.
Yeah.